Mike Johnson thought he could lecture Jasmine Crockett about constitutional law on live television. What happened next left the House Speaker completely speechless, and may have just delivered the most devastating political takedown of 2025. The most powerful Republican in the House of Representatives, a man who's built his entire political brand on constitutional expertise, sitting in stunned silence as a first-term Congresswoman systematically destroys every legal argument he's made. The cameras captured every second of his humiliation, and the internet is about to explode. The moment when a seasoned lawyer from Texas exposed the Speaker's constitutional ignorance in front of millions of Americans is about to go down in political history. But before we dive into how Jasmine Crockett just ended Mike Johnson's credibility with one brilliant legal argument, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because what you're about to witness will be talked about for years to come. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was a masterclass in how preparation, legal expertise, and fearless determination can completely dismantle even the most powerful opponents. Johnson walked into that hearing room thinking he'd easily handle any questions about his controversial emergency powers bill. Instead, he walked out looking like a law student who just failed his final exam in front of the entire class. And Johnson's face at the end? Pure political devastation. The kind of moment that ends careers and creates legends. We're talking about a constitutional scholar getting schooled so thoroughly that even his own Republican colleagues couldn't defend him. The aftermath is still sending shockwaves through Washington, and you're about to see exactly why. Here's what you need to understand about this epic confrontation. On one side, you have Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, constitutional lawyer, Louisiana Republican who's been playing politics for decades. He's used to being the smartest person in the room, the guy who lectures others about the Constitution and legal precedent. Johnson built his reputation as a constitutional scholar long before entering politics, working as a lawyer for the Alliance Defending Freedom, where he argued religious liberty cases before federal courts. His rise to Speaker wasn't accidental. Republicans chose him specifically because of his legal background and supposed constitutional expertise. He'd authored multiple legal briefs, taught constitutional law seminars, and consistently positioned himself as the party's go-to authority on constitutional matters. Johnson's colleagues regularly deferred to his legal opinions, and he'd grown accustomed to being the final word on constitutional interpretation within Republican circles. Johnson came into this hearing with his usual confidence. He'd done his homework, had his talking points ready, and expected to easily handle whatever came his way. After all, he's the Speaker. He controls the agenda, the timing, the entire flow of House business. More importantly, he genuinely believed his legal analysis was bulletproof. His staff had prepared extensive briefing materials, and multiple constitutional law experts had reviewed his position, or so he thought. On the other side, you have Jasmine Crockett, first-term Congresswoman from Texas, former public defender, civil rights attorney who spent her career fighting for justice in courtrooms across America. But calling her just a rookie would be a massive understatement. Crockett graduated from the University of Houston Law Center, where she served as editor of the Houston Law Review. She then spent years as a public defender, handling some of the most complex constitutional cases in Texas federal courts. Her legal career was marked by victories in cases involving Fourth Amendment violations, due process rights, and equal protection challenges. She'd argued before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals multiple times and had never lost a constitutional law motion in federal court. While Johnson was giving political speeches about the Constitution, Crockett was actually litigating constitutional cases and winning them. But here's what Johnson didn't know. Crockett had been preparing for this moment for weeks. While he was focused on party politics and media appearances, she was digging deep into constitutional law, studying precedents, and building an airtight legal argument that would expose the fundamental flaws in Johnson's position. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about one bill or one vote. This was about the future of constitutional interpretation, about whether political convenience could override legal precedent, and about whether a first-term Congresswoman could stand up to the most powerful Republican in the House. The issue at hand was Johnson's controversial interpretation of emergency powers during the ongoing border crisis. He'd been pushing a bill that many legal experts said violated separation of powers principles. Critics called it unconstitutional, but Johnson dismissed them as partisan attacks. What he didn't expect was for someone with Crockett's legal background to systematically tear apart his constitutional reasoning on live television. The stage was set for a showdown between political power and legal expertise, and only one of them would walk away with their credibility intact. The hearing started normally enough. Johnson, sitting at the head of the committee, opened with his standard remarks about border security and constitutional duties. His voice carried that familiar tone of authority, the confidence of someone who's never really been challenged on constitutional matters. Audio, Johnson's opening statement. The Constitution is clear about Congress's responsibility to protect our borders. This emergency authorization bill is not only constitutional, it's necessary for national security. The first few questions came from friendly Republicans who lobbed softball inquiries that allowed Johnson to expand on his talking points. He quoted founding fathers, referenced historical precedents, and spoke with the assurance of someone who genuinely believed he had the law on his side. Then came the Democrats' turn to question. A few members asked pointed questions about executive overreach and separation of powers, but Johnson handled them easily. He'd clearly prepared for these standard objections. The gentlelady from California doesn't seem to understand the difference between emergency powers and executive overreach, Johnson said with a slight smirk, drawing chuckles from his Republican colleagues. He leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd handled thousands of similar challenges throughout his career. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tried to press him on the potential for abuse of emergency powers, but Johnson dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. The Congresswoman's fears are unfounded. We have built-in safeguards and judicial oversight mechanisms that prevent any constitutional overreach, he replied, citing the Supreme Court's decision in Dames and Moore v. Regan to support his position on emergency executive authority. The Democratic members grew increasingly frustrated as Johnson seemed to have an answer for everything. He was clearly in his element, fielding constitutional questions with the ease of someone who'd been doing this for decades. Several Democratic staffers could be seen frantically passing notes to their bosses, trying to find new angles of attack, but Johnson anticipated every line of questioning. But then something shifted in the room. Jasmine Crockett had been sitting quietly, taking notes, studying Johnson's responses with the intensity of a lawyer preparing for cross-examination. Unlike her Democratic colleagues who were asking broad policy questions, Crockett was analyzing the specific legal citations Johnson was using, checking them against her own research, and building what would soon become a devastating legal argument. The cameras caught subtle changes in her body language, the way she sat up straighter when Johnson cited Youngstown Steel, the slight furrow in her brow when he referenced ex parte Milligan, the almost imperceptible shake of her head when he quoted from Korematsu. These weren't the reactions of someone who was intimidated or outmatched. These were the reactions of a seasoned litigator who had just realized her opponent had made fatal errors in his legal reasoning. When her turn finally came, the energy in the room changed completely. Even the Republican members seemed to sense that something different was about to happen. Mr. Speaker, Crockett began, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room pay attention. I've been listening to your constitutional arguments with great interest. As a former public defender who spent years in federal court, I have to say I'm confused by some of your legal reasoning. Johnson's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the tone he was used to hearing from freshman members. If the gentlelady has specific questions about constitutional law, I'm happy to educate her, Johnson replied, trying to regain his authoritative tone. That's when Crockett's eyes lit up. The word educate was exactly what she'd been hoping to hear. Oh, Mr. Speaker, I think there might be some confusion about who needs educating here, Crockett said, her voice still perfectly polite but now carrying an unmistakable challenge. The room went quiet. Even the Republican members stopped their side conversations to watch what was happening. This wasn't the usual partisan back and forth they were used to seeing. You see, Crockett continued, you've cited Youngstown Steel 3 times in your arguments today, but I don't think you've actually read the case, because if you had, you'd know it actually undermines your entire position. Johnson tried to interrupt, but Crockett wasn't finished. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, and she wasn't about to let him deflect with political talking points. In fact, she said, pulling out a thick folder of documents, I've prepared a detailed analysis of every constitutional precedent you've cited today. And Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, you've gotten almost every single one wrong. The tension in the room was electric. Republicans were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Democrats were leaning forward, sensing something big was about to happen. And Johnson? Johnson's face was starting to show the first signs of real concern. Now, I could go through each case individually, Crockett said, her voice gaining strength. But I think it would be more efficient to focus on the fundamental constitutional principle you seem to have forgotten. She stood up, papers in hand, and walked to the podium. Every camera in the room followed her movement. This was no longer a routine hearing. This was about to become a defining political moment. Mr. Speaker, you've built your entire argument on the premise that emergency powers trump constitutional limitations. But that's not how our system works. That's not how it's ever worked. And if you'd actually studied the cases you've been citing, you'd know that. Johnson tried to interject again, but Crockett held up her hand. I'm not finished, Mr. Speaker. You wanted to educate me about constitutional law? Well, class is now in session. What happened next was nothing short of a legal masterpiece. Jasmine Crockett didn't just disagree with Mike Johnson's constitutional interpretation. She systematically demolished it piece by piece, using his own cited cases against him with surgical precision. Let's start with Youngstown Steel, since you seem so fond of citing it, Crockett began, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who knew she was about to deliver a knockout blow. In Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company v. Sawyer, the Supreme Court explicitly rejected the idea that emergency powers give the executive branch unlimited authority. Justice Jackson's concurring opinion, which has become the foundation for separation of powers analysis, actually supports the exact opposite of what you're arguing. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. You cited this case to support emergency executive action. But, Mr. Speaker, this case literally struck down emergency executive action as unconstitutional. How do you explain that contradiction? Johnson tried to respond, stammering something about different interpretations and complex legal principles, but Crockett wasn't about to let him off the hook. Different interpretations? She said, her eyebrows raised. Mr. Speaker, this isn't a matter of interpretation. This is a matter of basic legal literacy. The case says the exact opposite of what you claim it says. The room was dead silent except for the clicking of cameras and the scratching of reporters' pens. Everyone could sense that something historic was happening. But Crockett was just getting started. She opened her folder and pulled out more documents. Now let's talk about Ex parte Milligan, another case you cited today. You used it to argue that wartime emergency powers justify suspending normal constitutional protections. But, Mr. Speaker, that case explicitly states that the Constitution cannot be suspended even during wartime emergencies. She read directly from her notes. The Constitution of the United States is a law for rulers and people, equally in war and in peace. That's a direct quote from Milligan. Are you familiar with that part of the decision? Johnson's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His usual confidence was completely gone, replaced by the dawning realization that he was being systematically exposed as constitutionally illiterate on live television. The context of that case, he started, but Crockett cut him off. The context, Mr. Speaker, is that you're citing cases you haven't read to support positions they actually reject. That's not constitutional law, that's constitutional malpractice. The camera zoomed in on Johnson's face, capturing every moment of his growing humiliation. This was the Speaker of the House, supposedly one of the most powerful people in America, being schooled like a first-year law student who hadn't done his homework. But Crockett still wasn't finished. She was building to her crescendo, and everyone in the room could feel it coming. Mr. Speaker, you graduated from law school. You've practiced law. You've taught constitutional law. How is it possible that you don't understand these basic constitutional principles? She paused for effect, her eyes locked on Johnson's increasingly panicked face. Unless you do understand them, and you're deliberately misrepresenting them to advance a political agenda that you know is unconstitutional. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Crockett had just suggested on live television that the Speaker of the House was either incompetent or deliberately dishonest about constitutional law. There was no middle ground, no face-saving interpretation. Johnson's face went through a range of emotions: shock, anger, desperation, and finally, resignation. He knew he'd been caught. He knew that millions of Americans had just watched him get exposed as either ignorant or dishonest about the very Constitution he'd sworn to uphold. I think, Johnson finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, we should move on to other questions. But Crockett wasn't about to let him escape that easily. Oh no, Mr. Speaker, you wanted to educate me about constitutional law. I think the American people deserve to hear your response to these discrepancies. How do you explain citing cases that contradict your own arguments? The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Johnson looked at his notes, looked at his staff, looked anywhere but at Crockett or the cameras. Finally, he mumbled something about consulting with legal counsel, and quickly gavelled the hearing into recess. But the damage was done. In less than 15 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had completely destroyed Mike Johnson's credibility on constitutional law, exposed his legal arguments as fundamentally flawed, and done it all with such precision and authority that even his Republican colleagues couldn't defend him. As Johnson fled the hearing room, Crockett remained at the podium, organizing her papers with the calm satisfaction of a lawyer who just won the biggest case of her career. The expression on her face said it all. Mission accomplished. The immediate aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's constitutional demolition of Mike Johnson was unlike anything political observers had seen in years. The hearing room itself became a scene of barely controlled chaos as reporters rushed to file breaking news stories and congressional staffers frantically called their bosses to report what they'd just witnessed. Within minutes of the hearing's abrupt recess, social media exploded with clips, reactions, and instant analysis of what many were already calling the most devastating political takedown in recent memory. The speed at which the story spread was unprecedented, faster than any political moment since the 6th of January hearings. Twitter's trending algorithms couldn't keep up with the volume of posts about the confrontation. The hashtag #CrockettSchoolsJohnson began trending within 30 minutes, followed quickly by #Constitutional Masterclass and #Speaker Meltdown. The video of Johnson's face during Crockett's systematic destruction of his arguments was shared thousands of times in the first hour alone. TikTok users began creating split-screen videos, showing Johnson's confident opening statements contrasted with his stunned silence at the end. Political Twitter went absolutely wild, but it wasn't just the usual partisan reactions. Constitutional law professors from across the country began weighing in, and their assessments were unanimous. Crockett was absolutely right, and Johnson's legal reasoning was fundamentally flawed. The academic legal community, which rarely weighs in so quickly on political moments, seemed compelled to validate Crockett's analysis. Professor Lawrence Tribe from Harvard Law posted a detailed thread breaking down each of Crockett's legal points, concluding, "Rep. Crockett just delivered the most precise constitutional analysis I've heard in Congress in years. Every point was legally sound and devastatingly accurate." His thread was retweeted over 50,000 times within 3 hours. Professor Neil Katyal, former acting Solicitor General, posted, "This is what happens when someone who actually knows constitutional law meets someone who just pretends to know it. Brutal and beautiful." Even conservative legal scholars, typically supportive of Republican positions, found themselves unable to defend Johnson's constitutional reasoning. But the reactions weren't limited to legal experts. Regular Americans were sharing the clips with amazement and admiration for Crockett's performance. "I don't know much about constitutional law, but I know what getting schooled looks like," wrote one viral tweet with over 100,000 likes. Another user posted, "Jasmine Crockett just showed us what real expertise looks like. This is why we need more lawyers and fewer politicians in Congress." The mainstream media picked up the story immediately. CNN's legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin called it one of the most impressive displays of constitutional knowledge I've ever seen from a member of Congress. MSNBC ran the clips repeatedly throughout the evening, with constitutional scholars providing additional context that only made Johnson look worse. Even Fox News, usually sympathetic to Republican leadership, had to acknowledge what had happened. Their legal analyst Andrew Napolitano said on air, "Regardless of party politics, Representative Crockett was absolutely correct on the law. The Speaker's constitutional reasoning was indeed flawed. But perhaps the most telling reactions came from within Congress itself. Republican members who had been sitting in that hearing room knew exactly what they had witnessed, and many were privately expressing concern about Johnson's leadership. One anonymous Republican aide told Politico, "We've always assumed the Speaker knew what he was talking about on constitutional issues. After today, we're not so sure about anything." Democratic members, meanwhile, were openly celebrating Crockett's performance. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries issued a statement praising her brilliant legal analysis and fearless dedication to constitutional principles. "Representative Crockett demonstrated today why we need more legal experts and fewer political hacks in positions of power," Jeffries said. Her mastery of constitutional law was evident to everyone watching. The implications of this confrontation extended far beyond a single hearing or even Johnson's personal embarrassment. Crockett had exposed a fundamental problem with how many politicians approach constitutional interpretation, touting it as a political tool rather than a serious legal discipline. Legal scholars began using the hearing as a teaching moment about the importance of actual constitutional knowledge versus political soundbites. Law schools across the country started incorporating the clips into their constitutional law courses, as examples of both proper legal reasoning and the dangers of constitutional ignorance. The political ramifications were equally significant and far-reaching. Johnson's credibility as a constitutional authority was permanently damaged, but the consequences extended well beyond his personal embarrassment. Within hours of the hearing, senior Republican members were privately questioning Johnson's leadership on legal matters. Senator Ted Cruz, himself a constitutional lawyer, was reportedly stunned by Johnson's performance and concerned about the party's credibility on constitutional issues. The House Republican Conference held an emergency meeting the following day, where multiple sources reported heated discussions about Johnson's constitutional competence. Representative Chip Roy, known for his own constitutional advocacy, was said to have questioned whether Johnson should continue leading on legal matters. The conference ultimately decided to limit Johnson's role in constitutional arguments and assign a team of lawyer members to review all future legal positions. Democrats, meanwhile, seized on the moment to elevate Crockett to leadership positions on constitutional matters. House Minority Leader Jeffries immediately appointed her to the House Judiciary Committee and announced she would lead a new Democratic task force on constitutional oversight. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee began featuring Crockett in fundraising materials, calling her the constitutional champion Democrats have been waiting for. But perhaps most importantly, the confrontation represented a generational shift in how constitutional law was being discussed in Congress. Crockett, representing a new generation of legal minds in politics, had shown that expertise and preparation could still triumph over political posturing and empty rhetoric. Law schools across the country began recruiting more diverse constitutional scholars, inspired by Crockett's example of bringing rigorous legal analysis to political debates. The broader message resonated with Americans who were tired of politicians who talked about the Constitution without actually understanding it. Polling conducted by Morning Consult in the week following the hearing showed that 73% of Americans believed elected officials should be required to pass a basic constitutional literacy test before taking office. More surprisingly, 68% of Republicans agreed with this proposition, suggesting that even Johnson's own party was concerned about constitutional competence in leadership. The American Bar Association issued an unprecedented statement calling for enhanced constitutional education for all elected officials, directly citing the Johnson-Crockett hearing as evidence of the need for such training. The Federal Society, despite its conservative leanings, praised Crockett's rigorous adherence to constitutional text and precedent, while conspicuously avoiding any defense of Johnson's arguments. In the days following the hearing, Crockett's office was flooded with interview requests, speaking invitations, and messages of support from legal organizations across the country. The American Constitution Society invited her to deliver their annual lecture on constitutional law. Harvard Law School asked her to participate in a symposium on separation of powers. Meanwhile, Johnson's office went into damage control mode, releasing statements about complex legal issues and different interpretational frameworks. But the explanations fell flat. Everyone had seen what happened on live television, and no amount of political spin could change the fundamental fact that he had been completely outmatched on constitutional law. The confrontation also sparked a broader conversation about the qualifications of political leaders. If the Speaker of the House, supposedly one of the most powerful people in America, could be so wrong about basic constitutional principles, what did that say about the quality of leadership in Washington? Constitutional law professors began calling for basic competency tests for members of Congress on the very document they swear to uphold. While such tests would never be implemented, the conversation itself highlighted how Crockett's performance had exposed a real problem in American politics. The international reaction was equally striking. Foreign media outlets covered the story as an example of American political dysfunction, but also as a sign of hope that some American politicians still took constitutional law seriously. The BBC ran a segment titled, "The Day American Constitutional Law Mattered Again," while German legal scholars praised Crockett's impressive demonstration of legal expertise in a political environment. As the weeks passed, the impact of that 15-minute exchange continued to grow. Crockett emerged as a national figure, frequently called upon to explain constitutional issues on major news programs. Her legal analysis was consistently praised for its clarity and accuracy. Johnson, meanwhile, found his influence diminished. Republicans began looking to other members for leadership on constitutional issues, and his ability to frame legal arguments for political purposes was severely compromised. The hearing became a case study in how preparation, expertise, and courage could still change the political conversation. In an era often dominated by sound bites and political theater, Crockett's methodical destruction of Johnson's arguments showed that substance could still triumph over style. Young lawyers and law students across the country found inspiration in Crockett's performance. Applications to public interest law programs increased, with many students citing her example as motivation to pursue careers in public service. The story became more than just a political moment. It became a reminder of what American democracy could look like when populated by people who actually understood the laws they were sworn to uphold. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Mike Johnson will be remembered as a defining moment in modern American politics. The day a first-term Congresswoman's constitutional expertise completely dismantled a speaker's political authority on live television. Political historians are already comparing it to legendary congressional moments like Joseph Welch's "Have you no sense of decency?" confrontation with Joseph McCarthy, or Anita Hill's testimony that changed how America discussed workplace harassment. But beyond the immediate political implications, this moment represented something more important. A demonstration that knowledge, preparation, and courage can still matter in politics. In an age of political theater and empty rhetoric, Crockett showed that actual expertise could still change the conversation. Law schools across America began incorporating the hearing into their constitutional law curricula as a perfect example of rigorous legal analysis in action. The ripple effects extended into legal education itself. Applications to constitutional law programs surged 40% in the months following the hearing, with many prospective students citing Crockett's performance as inspiration. The University of Texas Law School, Crockett's home state institution, reported that inquiries about public interest law careers doubled overnight. For Johnson, the hearing marked a permanent shift in his political standing. No longer could he claim constitutional authority without people remembering the day he was systematically exposed by someone who actually knew the law. Republican strategists privately admitted that Johnson's brand as a constitutional expert was irreparably damaged, forcing the party to find new voices on legal matters. Several prominent conservative legal organizations quietly distanced themselves from Johnson's constitutional interpretations. The Heritage Foundation, which had previously featured Johnson in constitutional law seminars, removed his materials from their website. The Federalist Society, while not explicitly criticizing Johnson, conspicuously began featuring other Republican lawyers in their constitutional programming. For Crockett, it launched her into national prominence as a serious legal mind and fearless advocate for constitutional principles. She had proven that a newcomer with real expertise could stand up to the most powerful people in Washington and win. Book publishers began reaching out with offers for constitutional law texts, and major law firms started courting her for potential partnerships after her congressional service. The hearing room where it all happened, now empty but historically significant. The message was clear. In American democracy, the Constitution still matters. Expertise still counts. And sometimes the most powerful political moments come not from rhetoric or theater, but from one person who knows the law standing up and speaking the truth. What did you think of Crockett's constitutional masterclass? Do you believe politicians should be required to demonstrate actual knowledge of the Constitution they swear to uphold? The implications of this moment extend far beyond just one hearing. It's about the very foundation of how our democracy functions and whether expertise still matters in politics. Drop your thoughts in the comments below about whether you think more lawyers like Crockett should run for office, or if you believe Johnson's embarrassment will force other politicians to actually study the Constitution before citing it. We want to hear your take on this historic moment. And don't forget to subscribe for more coverage of the moments when political courage meets constitutional knowledge. Turn on that notification bell because we're tracking every development in this story, unsading from Johnson's attempts at damage control to Crockett's rising influence in constitutional debates. Because in times like these, we need more leaders like Jasmine Crockett who aren't afraid to speak truth to power, even when that power sits in the speaker's chair. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with anyone who believes that constitutional expertise should matter more than political posturing. The Constitution deserves defenders who actually understand it, and America deserves leaders who know the difference between legal arguments and political talking points. This is just the beginning of what could be a complete transformation in how constitutional law is discussed in Congress. With experts like Crockett leading the charge, we might finally see an end to politicians who treat the Constitution like a political prop instead of the supreme law of the land. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single moment of this constitutional revolution.